Really proud to present our speaker today. I don't know if you've been to any of our previous classes here, but I think we're around number 5 or 6. Valerie Marvin is our presenter today on the subject of the female college and the fight for coeducation in Michigan. She serves as a historian and curator for the state capitol, which is a national landmark. And in this capacity, she oversees the Capitol historical collections and conducts research on Capitol and legislative history, sharing her findings through publications, lectures, and social media. She has a BA from the University of Michigan and an MS in historic preservation from Eastern University of Michigan. And I also want to add this because when I was chairman of the Social Science Committee, I can tell you that she got the best evaluations of anybody that I ever saw. So without further ado, Valerie, do it again.
Whatsoever. Thank you very much, Mike. That's very kind. It's nice to see many familiar faces this morning. Thank you for coming along for yet another ride. Before we get going, the Capitol does have very friendly, nonpartisan social media. We're trying to do more to promote the programming we do around the state. Is it okay if we take a couple pictures from the back of the room, just showing the back of your heads that we can post? Everybody good with that? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So thank you also for signing up for a class about something you've probably never heard of. The Michigan Female College tends to be a very Lansing-specific topic because the female college existed in Lansing for all of 14 years. But my goal today is to convince you that this is a story that affects everybody across the state of Michigan because it has to do with laying important foundations for the educational system that we now know and make use of. And it is, of course, important to start this off by recognizing that today, the majority of women who attend public colleges and universities, that women do make up, excuse me, got that wrong, too early in the morning for me still to get my words in the right order, that women make up a majority at this point of the attendees and the graduates from both public and I believe private colleges and universities as well in the state of Michigan. In fact, this is something we've seen more and more chatter about in the last 10 years, if you will. Not only are women meeting enrollment numbers to make up half the population of higher education classes, but they are also actually starting to surpass men at these institutions. Just a couple days ago, I had yet another article pop up on my feed that said, "Where have all the men on campus gone?" And I thought this is so interesting that we're talking about this and we're having this conversation. And there's, of course, an implication in there that something must be going wrong. And I think that's so interesting because, to be frank, the idea of equal numbers of college attendees and graduates between men and women is actually a very, very modern phenomenon. This is not something that has existed for very long. And frankly, for many people, they did not consider it an issue when for decades, centuries in parts of the world, it went the other direction. But at risk of veering into politics, I will stop there. Now, for today's talk, I need to give you some heads up on language. I am going to be talking today about 3 institutions that we all know by their modern names, but I'm going to be calling them things that may take a second to register. So this is fair warning. When I refer today to the university, I mean the University of Michigan. Now, that is not just my U of M arrogance coming out. I was born into a family of Spartans. I was only forgiven for going to U of M because, frankly, they offered me money. but I still get plenty of harassment in my family for the U of M pride, let me say, that is built in. I will also be referring to Eastern Michigan, not as Eastern, but as the normal school. Normal schools, of course, were schools for teachers, schools to teach people how to teach. Normal is a very old term in that sense. And of course, ultimately, it would be applied to multiple colleges or universities as we know them today. Eastern, Western, Central, Northern were all normal schools that drew students from a specific geographic location within the state, hence their geographic names. When I refer to the normal school today, though, I'm only talking about Eastern, because Eastern was the only one that existed during this period. And then the third one I'll be talking about is the ag school or the agriculture school. By this, I mean the university that I think of being about 4 miles down the road, because that's how far it is roughly from the capital to campus. And of course, MSU was the first successful agricultural college in the nation. Not the first overall. Other places had attempted to do this. There were some false starts out in New York, but MSU was the first to make a go of it. And of course, a few years into their story, once the Morrill Act is signed, it also becomes the first land grant funded institution of this sort. So please bear with me as I use these terms today. This is what happens when you have a speaker whose brain is firmly stuck in the 19th century. I make you deal with 19th century terms. Now, when you're talking about women in education, this is, of course, a topic that is as old as humanity, and it is impossible to know where to start. I basically threw a dart at the wall and said, I'm going to make my first general statement here. And I picked this moment, the Renaissance and the Reformation, because I see them as two movements that go together. I also see them as two movements that create the Western world we still live in to some extent. Now, obviously, for many of us in this room, I suspect our families were still in the old world as these things played out. And I come from simple enough stock. It is pretty much impossible to know what my family was doing during these things. But I can tell you that Western culture in general sort of went through these two earthquakes, if you will, in the 15 and 1600s. First of all, when we think of the Renaissance, we have to remember that the Renaissance is a revival. It is a revival in interest in classical ideals and classical education. So this is seeing Greece, seeing Rome through the lens of roughly 1500 Europe. And this became a source of inspiration for many artists and architects. Even when we think about our Capitol building, according to its architect Elijah Myers, was designed in what he called the Palladian style. Now, Palladian is just a derivation of the name Andrea Palladio, who was an Italian architect during the Renaissance, who reimagined Greek and Roman architecture for the Renaissance. And of course, there's an argument to be made that Western culture has just been chewing over and reinterpreting ideas from Greece and Rome for roughly 2,000 years. What's interesting to me at this point in time is we are very interested in thinking about still teaching the classics. And this is something I used to get very confused at as a child, because to me, the classics were Charles Dickens and Emily Bronte and, 19th century literature. But when we think in the mind of a 19th century American, that's pop culture. When they think classics, they are thinking Plato. They are thinking Aristotle. They are thinking Socrates. And in this period we'll be talking about today, we are still focusing our education on these classical texts. And there's a huge emphasis on language. We're going to talk today about how the study of Greek, the study of Latin, and for those who want to go into the church, the study of Hebrew. These are all important cornerstones of education in the 19th century. And that in part comes out of this era and the emphasis that is placed once again on Western thought. We also start to see more emphasis on education, but also a rending of the educational fabric, if you will, in this period. The Renaissance is often thought of as a time of learning, as is the Reformation. Now, I know I'm on the west side of the state. I can feel the Dutch Calvinist vibes the second I drive into Holland. Keep in mind, I'm saying this as a Protestant also, who has a lot of Roman Catholic family. When we look at the Reformation, I think the story we often hear in Protestant congregations is how the Reformation was a time of rebirth. It was a time of rediscovering the scriptures and most importantly, gaining direct access to the scriptures. And this brought with it an emphasis on literacy. Literacy not only for boys, but also for girls, because we should all learn to read the scriptures and learn to read our catechism and learn to have at least biblical literacy, regardless of whether we are male or female. But we also have to acknowledge that the new Protestant church, which is in some ways elevating literacy, and of course is closely tied to the wider distribution of the scriptures and the printing of the Bible in different vernacular languages. At the same time, though, it is shaking and sometimes tearing down parts of the Catholic educational establishment. When you think about places like England, where you see a shift in the state church, that brought the closing of a lot of monasteries and a lot of religious schools that were run by brothers or sisters. So just as more and more people are getting access to the scriptures, so some of the inherent educational systems that had been built up in the previous centuries are also being torn down. And this marks a shift for women in the loss of a quasi-profession. Because if you were growing up in a Catholic country, or for that matter, an Eastern Orthodox country, if you're growing up in high church world, if you will, one thing a woman can do with her life is she can join an order. And in some of those orders, she can pursue learning. She can learn to interact with the scriptures herself. She can write music. She can write prayers. She can serve as a leader within her female congregation. When we think about women like Hildegard van Bergen, think about what she did. Frankly, there wasn't a similar role for women in the Protestant church. And so there is a push and pull that is happening. Society shifts. Excuse me. Excuse me. There's a joke in here somewhere about the fact that I start to cough as I'm talking religion. All right. Anyway, you get the point. There's a lot going on in this era. And we have to think too about how historically religion and education and class are tied together. Class is a major factor in all of this. And we can see this in this publication, an essay to revise the ancient education of gentlewomen, written by Bethusa-Macon. This is considered to be one of, if not the first books published in English written by a woman. Bethusa-Macon grew up in an aristocratic family. Her education came largely from private tutors. She had brothers. Generally, the tutors were hired to educate the brothers, but if you had particularly curious little girls who had particularly open-minded parents, sometimes they would just let the girls sit in as well. And the girls would get virtually the same education as their brothers, which was a pretty remarkable thing. Bethusa would actually use this education to herself become an educator. She would rise up to serve as the governess to the daughters of King Charles I, which of course is a very good gig for a period of time, and then becomes a very bad gig when Charles I falls victim to the upheaval in England. And so she was forced to try to support herself otherwise as an educator. And she writes this piece basically defending the idea of educating girls and saying, we need to educate our daughters as well as our sons, in part because women need to have some sort of self-sufficiency. They may not always be able to rely on their male family members for support. And this will become a central tenet of the argument of why women need education. Because while the law may say that you are coverture is what I'm referring to, by your male family members, there are plenty of women who have to make it on their own, whose fathers pass, whose husbands pass, who do not have brothers who support them. And as a result, women struggle because there are very few respectable things a woman can do to earn her own bread. Now, in the American colonies, one thing a woman can do, and these often tend to be older women, sometimes they're widows, one thing a woman can do is she can run what was called a dame school. Now, dame schools were private ventures. These were often just neighborhood schools. This was a way a woman could welcome children into her house, earn a few pennies, if you will, a few pence in tuition from their parents to teach young children basic life skills. Now, these dame schools are largely co-educational. This is partially out of convenience, frankly. And we don't have a problem educating very small children together, boys and girls. Now, it is true that they may, even in dame schools, be separated out for different lessons. Very early on in the American colonial period, we see that boys and girls are often being taught different things. For example, girls are going to learn handicrafts in these schools, which of course are lessons that will be reinforced at home as well. And it is not uncommon to see this be a part of women's education throughout the 19th century, into the 20th century, if you were the girl who was automatically rolled in home ec class in high school because you're a girl. So girls take home ec and boys take shop. What's interesting to me is most of these dame schools also included at least basic lessons in literacy. So you would learn your numbers, you would learn your letters, you would learn some simple prayers. So perhaps the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer. If you're in a community that is devoted to one religious sect, you may learn some catechism. You know, these are things, the idea being that a mother could teach. It's okay for a mother, if she knows the catechism, to teach her children some of the catechism. That level of religious teaching by a woman is acceptable. What's interesting to me, though, is when you start to talk about not only reading these things and learning to recite things, but very quickly it becomes a question of, do you also teach them to write? Do you teach them to recognize letters or to also form them on the page? Because there's a different implication there. When you read something, you take information in. You're a learner. You are benefiting from someone else's expertise and knowledge. When you write something, that implies that you have something worth saying, that you have something worth saying that is worth preservation and that is worth sharing with someone else. Remember also in this era, paper is rare. Most documents in this era are still going to be written on parchment. It's expensive It takes a lot of money to be able to have lots of these resources to write your ideas down on. So there is a luxury implied there that I think often escapes us. Now, in the colonial and early American period, you do see two sort of systems of schools coming up. Some of the schools in America, particularly in the religious colonies, are going to be tied to a particular church, to a particular denomination. You think of even the old Ivy League schools on the East Coast. Most of them started out as Baptist or Congregationalist or this or that. And we even sometimes think of the colonies as having a particular religion tied to them, like the fact that Maryland was the Catholic colony, if you will. But as people start to move around more, and as you have fewer towns where everyone is Baptist or everyone is Catholic, then this idea of public education starts to crop up. And I'm sure for many, it seemed kind of weird coming out of Europe because frankly, most of the countries that our ancestors were coming from didn't really have public education. Education was something the church did. And a lot of times the quality of your education or the question of if you even had a local school was tied to your local clergyman. If your clergyman believed in educating the general populace and liked to teach, he could do a lot. If he did not see value in it, if he believed that only those who could afford to bring in their own tutors should have education, this was just the way of the world. Those who need to learn to read and write will do so. And those who need to just work in the farm fields their whole life, that's fine too. We don't want anyone to get above their station. It was very much personality driven in a lot of places. But in America, this is going to change because in America, we're trying something pretty different. We have a republic here. And this helps foster a phenomenon that today historians refer to as Republican motherhood. Now, I will couch this in a couple ways, as you can see in the language on this slide. First of all, again, this is a largely American phenomena. Remember, we are, by our thinking, the first republic in 1700 years when this country is formed. The second thing to keep in mind is this is a little R Republican. I'm not talking political parties. This means simply this is a phenomena coming out of a Republican government. And this phenomena is tied to the fact that in a Republican system, in theory, every little boy can grow up to be president, which means every little boy needs to be prepared for some level of public service, needs to be able to serve his community, because it's not just leadership by those born at the top of the pyramid. In theory, ours is a flexible enough system that you can rise up and you can assume leadership, even if you are not born to a sitting leader. And women use this to their advantage. I don't know how much of this was genuine. I don't know how much of it was women seeing the potential for the situation and seizing hold of it. But women start to say, well, if my son is going to grow up to be a councilman or a mayor or a congressman someday, he needs to get a good start on education right away, which means I need to be able to start that in the home, which means I need to be literate. Because, of course, the general supposition at the time is that most women are going to marry, are going to have children, and are going to become mothers. And this is, I think, a very clever sort of backdoor way to bring about a huge reform, because it suddenly means that not just half of the population has a claim to education, which, frankly, many in Europe would have found to be extremely radical as well, because of the class-based structure of European education. Now we're saying 100% of people need an education because they are all somehow going to influence those who could hold power someday. And this does so much for women because it means suddenly they need a more equal education with their male peers. Now, it doesn't mean education turns into true education where boys and girls are in the same classroom learning the same stuff together. Those of you who took home ec or shop class know there are some divisions that will linger for well over a century. But we have to recognize how radically different this was and how many opportunities it opened up. The next step, excuse me, the next step going forward then is how much education should be available. Now, in Michigan, we are part of the old Northwest Territory, and part of the language that creates the Northwest Territory talks about how this shall be a place where education is forever encouraged. And it is true that many of the political appointees who come to the Michigan Territory early on are themselves from old New England stock that have good educations, that have even in some cases university educations, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny percent of the population overall. In Michigan, when we think of these men, perhaps the flag bearer for them, if you will, was a man named Augustus Woodward, who was quite a character, to put it politely. We know him best today as the namesake of Woodward Avenue in Detroit. But Augustus Woodward saw virtually unlimited potential for what he saw as the new place of Michigan. And because he was working here as a territorial judge, because he wrote the Woodward Code, which was really the first set of laws that govern the territory of Michigan, he has an immense impact on the state. And one thing Judge Woodward does is he gets together. Now, keep in mind, Woodward is, historians would say, probably a deist. He is not a religious man. He does not affiliate with a particular church or denomination, but he gets together with some other unusually educated men in the Michigan Territory, including a Roman Catholic priest who was born in France and sent to America as a missionary, this being Father Gabriel Richard, and a Presbyterian minister. And they decide they want to set up a top to bottom structure for education in Michigan, for public education in Michigan, because they want children to be able to have access to learning, whether they are Roman Catholic, whether they are Presbyterian, whether they are Methodist, whether their families are nothing at all when it comes to religious affiliation. And they create this absolutely massive and beautiful and completely unobtainable scheme that they call the Catholic-Epistemiad. That's the word you see on your screen, or that, at least that's my attempt to pronounce it. I've never quite known if it's right. Catholic-Epistemiad. Now, we look at that and we see big C and we think, ooh, Catholic Church. No, think about the meaning of the word Catholic. Catholic means universal. And this is in the little c Catholic sense. So when some of us say the creeds, we talk about we belong to one Catholic and Apostolic Church. Doesn't mean I'm Roman Catholic. It means I belong to the Universal Christian Church. It's capitalized here simply because this was the proper title of the system they tried to create. And this system was supposed to design a series of primary schools. So what we would think of as kind of elementary schools, let's think in the K-8 sense, even though kindergarten doesn't really exist yet, and we're not doing graded schools most places. Then they have a series of institutes or colleges. Think of those as like high schools, if you will. And then at the top sits a University of Michigania. That's supposed to be at the very top level of education. And yes, this is an ancestor of the University of Michigan. Now, unfortunately, nobody has the money in Michigan to fund all of this. And there is no infrastructure to actually build all of these schools and establish all of these districts as we would think of them. So basically, these three guys get together and they rent space in a building in Detroit, and they start to give what they think of it as university level classes. And they soon discover that there are virtually no kids around who are ready for this level of learning. So this is mostly conceptual, but this will lay the foundation for multiple pieces of our story today. In part because this creates a relationship between other institutes or colleges. Now, because we don't have money to actually fund all of this stuff, Instead, these guys say, well, there are a number of religious schools that already exist. Let's partner with them, and they can prepare students at what we would think of as the high school level. And then they will be, at least the men, will be ready to feed into the university. And one of these schools that they partner with is the Huron Valley Institute, which becomes the Huron Valley branch because it is a branch of this Catholic Epistemiad. This, of course, is Kalamazoo College. This is an American Baptist school that is founded by Baptists in part to educate ministers for work in the church, but also will offer some other levels of education. This is also a reminder that university education has traditionally been geared towards men going into the 3 traditional professions. Can anyone name those professions for me? At least one of them? Doctor, lawyer, minister. Yep, the church, the law, medicine. So why would women have to worry about this? These aren't things women do. That university, that top tier of education, that's for men. Now, the University of Michigan, there's a raging debate still today. Was it really founded in 1817, or was that just more a concept and words on paper? It definitely gets more gumption in 1837, which is when the legislature incorporates it a second time. And that's when they move to Ann Arbor. And in Ann Arbor, the university will grow up into what we today know as U of M. Here you can see an oil painting of campus as it looked about 1855. What I think is very interesting is even at this time, there was a goal with the faculty that the professors who would oversee the different schools, so there was a medical school and a law school and so on, that they would be adherents to different sects. So you would not have at any time a whole faculty full of Methodists, or you would not have a whole faculty full of Reformed members or Catholics or Presbyterians. They would very quietly but intentionally say, okay, well, we need a new professor of Latin, and we should look for somebody who's Presbyterian because we don't have any Presbyterians right now. That being said, though, they do not teach religious doctrine in school. They expect students to belong to a congregation in Ann Arbor early on, but they do not teach religious doctrine. And this is one of the things that makes U of M radically different from the get-go, is it is not a religious institution. It is a public school, and we keep those things separate in Michigan. Now, this is all well and good for the boys who can get in. But the problem is there are some girls who think they deserve admission to the university. Now, admittedly, these girls were daring in multiple ways, not just in that they wanted an education and thought that they, as the daughters of taxpayers paying for these institutions, deserved a right to attend. Some of these girls also wanted to go into the professions. Now, there's a long, complicated history of women and medicine, and we're not going to get into that today. But of course, women traditionally in many communities have been healers. They have been midwives. That will change as medicine becomes more of a profession. Then there's the law. But specifically with Augusta Chapin, we're talking about the church. Augusta Chapin was a little girl who believed that God called her to the ministry. Now, that made my grandmother's eyebrows go up in 1992 when we got our first husband-wife pastor team at my church. This girl in the 1850s is claiming that she feels a call from God to the ministry. And in some ways, it makes no sense whatsoever for her to want to go to U of M because it's not going to make her a minister. It's not a religious school, but it's what she can afford. It's because it's a public school. And she also knows that if she can get admittance, she can learn Latin and she can learn Greek and she can learn Hebrew because they do teach those traditional languages associated with religion. So she is one of multiple young women who in the 1850s petitioned both the Board of Regents, The regents, of course, are the gatekeepers at the university. They are reviewing individual applications in this period. That's how small the student body is. And when that doesn't work, they petition the legislature. Now, of course, in this country, we have a long history of the idea that individuals can petition the government for certain things. And this is a right that we see being exercised frequently. You can see this in old government documents, which of course are one of my weird happy places. In some cases, you can see actual word for word transcriptions of the petitions coming in. And by the mid-19th century, some of these petitions are signed not only by men, but by a few daring women as well, who have the right to think that they, as individual citizens, have the position to be able to ask the government for something. Now, the general response is, well, if you want more education, go down the road to Ypsilanti. Go to the normal school. They accept girls. That's good enough, right? Well, it is okay for some women who want to be teachers. Now, women are increasingly staking a claim on the idea that women can be teachers. As of the 1830s out east, 1840s, 1850s in this part of the world, and they are hired more and more as teachers for two reasons. One, this again goes back to the idea that every woman is destined to be a mother. This means that all women must love children and want to spend their days wrangling them. You will hear the sarcasm in my voice, of course. I far prefer talking to adults than I do children. The second thing is, a lot of school districts start to realize they can pay female teachers a lower wage. So women start to be hired in more schools, at least at the younger levels, which means from the beginning, from 1849, when Michigan does another really weird educational thing and founds a normal school, implying that teaching is a profession that one can be prepared for and that one could make a career of, they admit women. But they very quickly realize they have a problem because there are a lot of female students who are applying who have absolutely no desire to become teachers. They just want more education, and they can get it inexpensively here. Now, the leadership at the normal school is not geeked about this. And frankly, they start to try to figure out ways around it. Can we make them sign something that says after you graduate, you have to teach for so many years? Because they want, their whole mission is to equip lots of teachers to go out and work in schools across Michigan so we can lift the entire populace up through education. Well, some women say, why should I even bother? I don't want this kind of education. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lawyer. My father is a lawyer. If I work with him every day in his office and can understand what he's talking about, why can't I pursue that same end as well? I want to go to the university. Now, there is hope in 1855 that something might happen. Governor Kinsley Bingham, who is the first Republican governor of Michigan. He is coming in for his first term in 1855. He's kind of an out-of-box thinker. He had previously been a Democrat, so he switches parties over the issue of slavery. And of course, enslavement in America is something that had been tying us in knots for 200 years, and those knots would only get tighter. And the Republican Party initially is created out of this weird combination of Whigs. That's a term we don't think of too much, but that's a big political party in early America. It is from Free Soil Democrats, which is what Bingham identified as. What's a Free Soil Democrat? It's a Democrat who doesn't like the idea of expanding slavery. They're not necessarily ready to get rid of it everywhere, but they don't want to see it go westward. They don't want to see slavery in Kansas and Nebraska and California as more and more states join the Union. So basically, there's a political earthquake, and all of these free soilers, these people who do not want to see the expansion of slavery, form this new Republican Party. And you can see in the first few years, they are really struggling to figure out what else they can all get behind, because many of them have previously been political opponents. Talk about politics making for strange bedfellows. This is like the quintessential American example. Now, Bingham is a farmer as well as being a lawyer. And he looks around and he sees a lot of farmers in the legislature. And he understands Michigan's economy is largely driven by agriculture in this period. So he gets on board with the idea of founding an agricultural school in Michigan. He also, though, in the same State of the State address in which he announces his support for that, he also announces his support for something called a female seminary. Now, female seminary, we hear the word seminary, we think church, we think training for ministry. In the 19th century, that was just kind of more meant a female school. It's weird to us today, but they use the term totally differently. A female seminary, it was argued, could serve as kind of a sister school to the university. It wouldn't necessarily prepare women for the church or medicine or law, but it would give them another level of higher education that could be geared more towards what women were going to do with their lives. And Bingham endorses both of these, but the legislature only funds one. And of course, that one is the agricultural school in 1855, when it is birthed on a piece of paper. And just to give you an indication of how weird even this was and how chancy it felt, the legislation to create the agricultural college said it had to be established within 10 miles of the capital, so government could keep a close eye on it because they were not sure this was going to work. Now, at this same time, there are two sisters who are dipping their toes into these debates. I only have a photo of one, and in some ways that is so indicative of how this pair worked. Abigail and Delia Rogers were sisters who were born to a pretty radical family in upstate New York. Their parents eventually ended up in Rochester. In fact, Abigail is buried with her parents and some of her New York family in the same cemetery as Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. That's a reminder of what this part of the world was like in this era. They are part of a lot of upheaval and foment, not only over the issue of slavery, but also over questions about who is a citizen, who gets to do what. Upstate New York, of course, this is where Seneca Falls is. This is where the first women's rights convention is held, where for the first time, a group of women and men put down ideas on paper that suggest that men and women both deserve an equal role in this American experiment. Now, they are both unusually well educated. They are born and raised in a Methodist family. This is when, so we use the term Wesleyan, and today the Wesleyan Church and Methodist Church are separate. That split had not happened yet. They will both go to the Genesee Wesleyan Seminary in Lima, New York, which is a private school. It is also coeducational all the way up. Now, this seminary is going to give them basically what we would think of today as probably a high school education, but it is considered to be a very good education. And students sometimes go to the same classes. There are a few classes, I believe, that were segregated by sex. The students are also living in the same building. And for many of the teachers there, they say this is natural. This is a family. This is how we function. We have sons and daughters. Why do we not raise and educate our sons and daughters together? Now, at this school, Abigail particularly will show real promise. And in this, she follows in the footsteps of her older sister, Eliza. Eliza will actually become the first female preceptress. That means the first sort of ranking woman whose job it is to oversee the education and care of the other women. Think of her as kind of like a high-level house mother, if you will. And when Eliza, after marrying and having a couple children, has to step back from this role for a few years, Abigail steps into it. Abigail will serve as female preceptress here, and then when her sister Eliza can come back, she will then go and teach and help administer a couple other women's colleges, one in just outside of New York City, one in Ontario. So she clearly likes the idea of pursuing a career in education. Ultimately, she will come to Michigan to work at the Wesleyan Seminary in Albion. This is what we today know as Albion College. Her sister Delia will come with her. I think Delia may have taught some classes as well. Delia, though, always lived in her sister's shadow. And I think that was a deliberate choice. I think it was their personalities. Abigail had no problem being a public woman, which was a really weird thing to be in the 19th century. She had no problem having her picture taken. She had no problem speaking before what were called promiscuous audiences, being men and women together. Her sister Delia preferred to serve in a more support role. She was happy to do the work, but she was going to let her sister be the face of it. They will work together a few years at Wesleyan Seminary in Albion, and then Abigail will be recruited to come to the Michigan Normal School when this opens in 1849, and she will serve in the early 1850s as the first female preceptress there. If memory serves me right, she was one of, I think, 4 faculty members early on. So this is not a big school. You know, the whole school fits in this building in the early days. And as one of her students later wrote, she said it was in this normal school that she, Abigail, became more directly a recognized champion of the education interests of women. Her practical eye clearly saw that a chief cause of the multitude of failures of women in the various avenues of life was the lack of thorough preparation for her duties. She believed that a woman has a right to do whatever she can do well, and for what she does well, she will receive adequate compensation. Now, in this period, Abigail will also get involved with a new group called the Michigan State Teachers Association. This is a group of teachers mostly working in higher education, though there are some common school members as well. They will get together, they will have an annual conference where they talk about education. This completely is an umbrella organization that includes both public and private. So it's not unusual to see people from Hillsdale College and people from the university and people from the ag school and people from Albion and Adrian and the Baptists over in Kalamazoo all coming together. They all see themselves as part of the same movement to try to improve educational opportunities in our state. Now, they also produce a monthly journal, which thankfully survives in the rare book room at the Library of Michigan and a few other places. And Abigail starts to write articles for it. So she starts to put her ideas not only out there when she's speaking at their conferences, but also in print. One is called The Teacher, What He Should Be. Basically, she's arguing for higher standards. Now, she writes this, as we are all taught historically, using the English language with the general subject of he. But I always see the word she when I imagine this coming from Abigail's pen, so I'm going to read it with that slight change. Quote, "It is the unquestionable duty of every human being, a duty which she owes both of God and woman, to develop and cultivate to the utmost extent of her ability all the powers with which she is gifted. The teacher who is thus ready to combat public opinion when it is wrong, and she feels it needful, will find that she wakes into life and activity the dormant sense and sensibility of those who oppose her." In other words, teachers need to be ready to stand up and to use their position and their platform to be able to speak for change, even if it makes you unpopular. Now, Abigail will do this throughout the remainder of her life on behalf of education. But I will tell you, even she had her limits. When she realized she was going to become an advocate for education, for co-education specifically, what some people saw as literally thwarting the will of God, because some would say, God made man, God made woman, they're different. They need different things. We should not smush everybody together and confuse all of this. That meant she didn't dip her toe in other fights. So, for example, she never, ever, ever came out in support of women's suffrage. Now, that doesn't mean she didn't support suffrage. I think she may have, at least her actions mirrored those of many women who did come out in support of it. But she felt, as many of us often do, I have this number of chips I can play, and I'm going to place all of those chips over here. I will spend my political capital on this issue and not get distracted by that issue, because people will judge me by that issue, who I might be able to win as converts to this issue. Whether or not we realize it, I think we are all constantly playing this game in our minds. So she is watching as these petitions come into the legislature. She is watching as young girls like Augusta Chapin are saying, hello, my parents are taxpayers too. Please educate me. And she decides, well, if the legislature is not going to do anything about it, if the Board of Regents aren't going to do anything about it, well, what are we going to do? And there are some people who, when the legislature of 1855 fails to fund that female seminary, they say, okay, perhaps this was best. There's one preliminary question which we should settle before establishing any more separate schools for females. It is whether the true philosophy of education does not point to the education of the sexes in the same institution, and our university and colleges should be required to admit ladies. Back in New York, Big Sister Eliza is also writing about this and sending articles to the State Teacher Association newsletter. She says one great obstacle to the extension of a liberal and large system of female education is the prevalence of the feeling that the two sexes must be educated differently and apart. This is one of those afflicting pieces of absurdity which escape, I cannot say this word, yes, whatever that is, because custom and fashion have so long thrown over it their sanction. So Abigail resigns from the normal school, and she and Delia pick up and move to Lansing. And somehow, oh my gosh, do I wish I knew how, they get permission to use the chambers in the state capitol building for their new school, which they are calling the Michigan Female College. Now, it is true that the second capitol served as a sort of town hall for Lansing. Lansing was a very small place. The Capitol was a decently sized building. It was non-sectarian. It didn't belong to the Baptists or the Presbyterians. It belonged to everybody. And so everybody made routine use of it. The House and the Senate chambers were inherently kind of big meeting rooms, and people could get permission to use them for a variety of things. It could be a Thanksgiving service, a community Thanksgiving service for the holiday. It could be a 4th of July party. It could be a dinner to raise money for something for the city of Lansing. It could be some sort of special dance. Before Lansing Civil War soldiers went off to fight in 1862, I think that company enlisted, they had a dinner at the Capitol and they danced in the Senate chamber that night. So these rooms were very available. But to give the use of these rooms to a school that is going to use them 6 days a week to educate girls, wow, that's something. Because I will tell you, existing in the Capitol is a form of reminding government you exist. If you don't believe me, come hang out in Heritage Hall, our new welcome center that we built a couple of years ago, in the springtime. You will find at least 3 different groups in there every day who want to come and have a luncheon and have a breakfast and have a reception and get the attention of the legislators and make their presence felt. When you are in the Capitol, you are under the nose of government. You remind government you exist. So to be able to put their school in the Capitol was a giant coup, frankly, politically. It also speaks to the fact that a lot of people in Lansing wanted better education for girls. A lot of their sons could go down the street to the ag school. That was good. But where do I send my smart daughter? You will start to see a lot of newspaper articles about this because Lansing is a small, gossipy little place. Everything ends up in the newspaper. There's only so much going on. And we can see, for example, here the faculty of the new female college. Miss A.C. Rogers, so that's Abigail. Miss H.K. Clapp, she also came up from Ipsy with them. Miss Delia Rogers, so she's there too. Professor Borgman, late of Cincinnati, and Professor Horner. So these 2 are men. Now, the title female college is more to poke than it is an actual statement that this was a school for girls. In truth, they always had male and female teachers, and they always had male and female students. 1, because they needed every last tuition dollar they could get. They were doing this on a shoestring. 2, their whole purpose was to eventually put themselves out of business. They wanted to prove coeducation worked. You could put boys and girls together in the same classroom and the walls would not fall down. Now, there are many newspaper articles from the 1850s and 1860s. The Rogers sisters were pretty good at press, and these are complimentary, and they note not only what is going on in their classes, they invite the public to their public examinations. There are literary entertainments that are being given in the evenings in the chambers. The idea is to have a constant stream of interaction with the public so they can see this school is a success and that what it's doing works just fine. This is not revolutionary, and the girls are performing just as well as the boys. Now, this will continue past their capital time. The female college will exist within the capital for about a year and a half. Then they have to pack up and move out because the legislature is going to be back in town for session. But regardless, as soon as the legislature is back in town, as soon as there's press in town for something, the Mrs. Rogers always invite them down to the female college because they want them to see what they are doing. So here we have an article, this is ironically from an Ann Arbor newspaper, where a reporter writes about a reception he's been to at the female college last night, where several of the girls recited. And by the way, there was a careful balance in these events. It wasn't just, we're going to stand up and be scholarly. It was also, we're going to at the same time be good feminine hosts. So we're going to serve you tea and cakes, and we may wear dresses that we made in our sewing classes, because they want to show that education does not, as the Victorians would have said, unsex you. It does not render you less of a woman because you happen to use your brain. And one of these reporters writes this: if any of our readers have daughters to send abroad, meaning out of town, they cannot do better than to place them in the Michigan Female College. I'm sure that was meant as a compliment, but how double-edged is it? They cannot do better than to place them in the Michigan Female College because the university won't take them. Now, the Rogers sisters will get financial backing from several wealthy men in Lansing and elsewhere in the state. They will eventually be able to start to develop their own campus in what is today Old Town, or North Lansing, if you're thinking back 40 years. If you ever visited the campus of the Michigan School for the Blind, as it was, that's where this was. So just about a mile or so north of the Capitol, not quite. This is what the Rogers sisters hoped to build. This is what appears on our nice 1866 bird's eye view. This was aspirational, to be honest. That is what they could actually afford. As often would happen with these construction projects in this era, they fundraised and built a wing at a time. And they honestly only ever got one wing built. And that wing would stand kind of by itself, a few trees around it. This would have been out in the country to some extent at the time. That does not mean, though, that they didn't want to sell themselves as something better. This is the stationery that they had created for the female college. It is beautiful. And it is, that's technically the same little three-wing building that we see on the bird's eye. I have to wonder, though, if there were a few disappointed pupils and parents who arrived after, paying tuition and getting everything set, and here's our move-in day, and oh, that's not quite so nice. Oh, well, at least the Rogers sisters knew how to market, if you will. And here we can see again, Abigail as the public sister. Her name's on the envelope. She is the principal. She is the one running the show. Now, we do not have records from the school that survive, at least not that I found. There are a few things tucked in family papers here or there. A colleague of mine turned up some things down at the Burton collection in Detroit a few years ago. This is a program from the junior exhibition, and we can see here the names of some students, and we can also see where they're coming from. So we've got Lansing, we've got Trenton, we've got Bay City, we've got Saginaw City, we've got East Saginaw over here. So they are drawing a student body from across Michigan and from outside of Michigan as well. There are some students who are traveling across state lines to go to this school. And they will offer diplomas. Here we can see Lucy Breton earned 2. This was in keeping with how diplomas would have been issued from a place like Albion College or Adrian. So we have a mistress of arts and we have a mistress of science. So just as today you pick your major, you could study arts, you could study sciences. And the arts degree would have been considered more traditional for women. The sciences would have been a little more daring because it implies that a woman's brain can understand the sciences and can ask questions and engage in a scientific dialogue. And of course, that's a big part of this is what are women's brains capable of? There was, I say this as if it's a past tense thing, there was serious conversation at the time that men and women were wired so differently, and women being smaller had smaller brains. We just didn't have the capacity for learning. Not only that, by the late 19th century, there's a very, very, very vocal movement that says that if women learn, as the brain develops, other organs shrink and render themselves unuseful. And thankfully, we laugh at this today, but this was very serious. There were people who claimed that if women became educated, they would lose their physical capacity to reproduce. And therefore, they were thwarting the will of God because that's what God made them to do, was to perpetuate the human race. Now, we do know some of the women who graduated from the female college because they later bragged about it. When they became somebody and wrote those nice bios in those big, thick county histories, they would say, I went to the female college. Now, most of them also who became professionals went on and got further education somewhere else. But still, Reverend Augusta Chapin does achieve becoming a pastor. She is ordained in 1863 in the Universalist tradition at this church in Lansing. Now, granted, Universalism is controversial in this era, certainly. Quite frankly, though, Universalists were the only ones willing to ordain women at this point. I don't know if she grew up in a Universalist family or not. I've not picked up that piece of the story, but this is where she would be accepted. And she would serve as clergy in the Universalist Church, serving in multiple states, multiple pulpits the rest of her life. So she was able to fulfill what she saw as her call from God. Anna Ballard will become a doctor. She will go to a medical school in Chicago that trains women. She will ultimately move back to Lansing. She will become the doctor for Society Women of Lansing. And there is an argument that maybe we should be sending women into medicine because if we believe of separation of spheres, if we believe that men and women are very inherently different, maybe women should have the opportunity to talk to other women about their bodies, to talk about very personal things. And this is, I think something that still speaks to a lot of us today. I prefer to have a female doctor because I like knowing that my doctor has a basic sense of how female bodies work. Dr. Ballard would also maintain an interest in politics and in political issues the rest of her life. She would become a part of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which sometimes sounds like a bunch of very nice ladies who don't want you to have a glass of wine for dinner. But remember also, these women are dealing with addiction, and addiction is something we still wrestle with as a society today. And they said, if the government's not going to fix it, maybe we can do something to help that. Another issue that Dr. Ballard got very involved with and testified before legislative committees on was age of consent. This was part of the WCTU's broader movement as well. In the 1880s, when Dr. Ballard was testifying before the legislature in Michigan, she wanted to see the age of consent in Michigan become 18. The age of consent in Michigan, up to this point, was 10. She was able to work with the legislature to get it up to 14. Not perfect, but better than 10. So the female college, in some ways, has a remarkable impact just by existing. They are turning out graduates who are going and doing things in the world, who are not afraid to use their voices and speak up on complicated issues. They are continuing to exist in the middle of Lansing. They are continuing to interact with the legislature. Here you can see there is a sermon being given to the young ladies of the college, an evening event at Representatives Hall. The annual examination at the college will be open. That will take place in Representatives Hall on Friday evening. Once Abigail and Delia get the school going, they're not done. They don't see their work as finished. They simply see this as a step on the road. And they will make also deliberate overtures to the agricultural college, to the boys down the street, if you will, to give them opportunities to do things together. Because again, they want to show that boys and girls can coexist, that they have similar interests and similar abilities. And they're not the only people doing this. They're doing it in Lansing. They have the most impact in the capital, which frankly is my excuse for how I get to tell this story as the Capitol historian, but they're not doing this in a vacuum. There are other people doing similar work elsewhere, including a woman named Lucinda Hinsdale Stone, who, if you are familiar with the Kalamazoo area, or if you're familiar with the history of the Women's Club movement in Lansing, may be a name you know. Lucinda Hinsdale Stone grew up in Vermont, was heartbroken as a child when she realized her big brother could go to the University of Vermont, but they would not accept girls. She would attend a local private school as long as she could. She would marry one of her teachers, who would become a Baptist pastor, Reverend James Stone, who is given the pulpit in Kalamazoo. The pulpit in Kalamazoo, oh, golly gee, imagine that, also means you are simultaneously, for no extra pay, the president of Kalamazoo Baptist College. And there is an expectation that if you have a capable wife, she will, for no extra pay, teach the girls at the college. And this college, if you will, that's the old Michigan and Huron Institute. And the Stones are involved in the same teachers association as Abigail Rogers. They are moving in the same circles. They are working in some ways towards the same goal because they realize there was once this idea that these different institutes, these different colleges would prepare students for the university. And so if we are sending our boys to the university when they graduate, why can't we send our girls too? Because Mrs. Stone says, I have female students who are just as smart as the boys. One of them was a young lady named Alice Boise. Alice's father taught at U of M. He was a professor. Alice in 1866 petitioned the regents for permission to enroll and take classes. They told her she could only take her father's class, because then her father was in the room, she would have a chaperone, and nothing improper would happen. So she enrolled for no credit. She took that course, and she couldn't do anything else. Around the same time, a new private school called the University of Chicago is being formed. They recruit Professor Boise to come, and he comes with a condition. My daughter needs to be able to go to school here. And Alice Boise becomes the first female graduate of the new University of Chicago. Meanwhile, both Lucinda and Abigail are constantly drumming away on this idea that education can be respectable. This shouldn't be seen as revolutionary. This shouldn't be seen as trying to upset the social order. And Abigail even manages to get the ear of Sarah Josepha Hale, which you want to talk about serious drivers of middle-class culture in 19th century America. This is the lady who edited Godey's Ladies book. Her publication landed on every parlor table in every small town, in every family who could afford it. This is like 50 years ago being the editor of, Ladies' Home Journal or Good Housekeeping. I remember my grandmother could not exist without those publications. That was to her the key to maintaining a part in broader American female culture. And Sarah Josepha Hale will, in her publication that goes to millions of homes, endorse the female college as the only institution in this country, with the exception of Vassar College, that offers American women an education professedly collegiate. And Abigail, she will quote as saying, that women has other claims upon the state than simply to be governed. This has ceased to be a dream and has become an idea Sometime in the future, it may cease to be an idea and become a fact. So Abigail is trying every strategy she can to inch forward. Now, part of this trying means she is continually, also quite literally, lobbying the legislature. Now, in this period, the legislature meets every 2 years. They're coming to Lansing in odd numbered years. And part of what they do, of course, is they create a state budget. And this budget includes funding for the university, includes funding for the agricultural college. What this means for Abigail is every 2 years when they're back in town, she will work with other advocates to try to draft yet another bill saying we're going to either force the regions to open up U of M or we're going to fund women's education. There were some people who said the state should just take over the female college. The female college should become a state entity so it will have broader support, so it can expand and it can accept more students with lower tuition. It will become that de facto female seminary, if you will. Now, that would have meant kicking out all of the male students and sending them someplace else, but some people were okay with that compromise. Other people said, no, we just need to open up the university. And the legislature in 1867 and 1869 passed 2 resolutions, which resolutions are nice statements. They don't do anything real. They do not have the power of law. A resolution is words on paper. Sometimes they're effective, sometimes they're window dressing, frankly. So they passed resolutions saying the regions should reconsider their position on admitting women. This is not enough for Abigail. And so one evening in the chamber, after the legislatures met, they have what they called an indignation meeting, hence the title of this talk, where a bunch of people get up and basically grouse and say the legislature continues to ignore us. This isn't right. As Abigail says, quote, this legislature voted $130,000 for the next 2 years for the education of young men. But the women received nothing of what they asked for, but much advice. You can feel the steam coming out of her ears. And then she goes to make a trip out of state. She falls ill, and quite suddenly she dies. Her sister Delia suffers an accident. Getting out of a carriage, she falls. She's laid up for a while. And suddenly, out of the clear blue, the Michigan Female College closes. So now we've lost something. But we also gain something because things are also changing down in Ann Arbor. The president of the university leaves, takes another job elsewhere. That means a faculty member, Professor Freeze, becomes acting president, position he will hold for less than 2 years. There's also a new person coming on the Board of Regents, Mr. Willard from Kalamazoo, who is friends with James and Lucinda Stone, who have convinced him there is something to this idea of coeducation. And they suddenly look around the room and count the noses and realize, oh my gosh, we think we have a majority on the board now at U of M. And they go back and pull out those laws written in the 1830s when the university is reincorporated. It's possible they went out and pulled back those original statements from 1817 too as well. I think they may have. And they look and they look and they look and they suddenly realize, you know, nothing says women can't be admitted. There was no legal prohibition ever. It was just how the law was interpreted. So at their first board meeting in 1870, they pass a resolution. This resolution actually has teeth. This isn't a resolution. How do they say it? I forget the term they use. That says the Board of Regents recognize the right of every resident of Michigan to the enjoyment of the privileges afforded by the university, and that no rule exists in any of the university statutes for the exclusion of any person from the university who possesses the required literary and moral qualifications. Translation, ladies, send us your applications. And they did. Lucinda Hinsdale Stone was super excited. And she very quickly reached out to one of her recent graduates, a woman named Madeline Stockwell, and said, you need to apply. And Madeline did. She took the entrance exams. She not only passed them, she became the first woman to enter the University of Michigan as a full-fledged student as a sophomore because Mrs. Stone had prepared her so well. She would continue at the university. She would graduate. Other women would graduate. And we're not getting domestic arts degrees from the University of Michigan. We're getting bachelor's degrees in the arts and sciences. We're getting degrees in law and medicine. Women are entering the professional schools. Now, it's not to say it was seamless. You know, there was consternation about, are we going to let the women see us dissect a body? Are we going to study anatomy? Are we going to have a curtain down the middle of the room? Are we going to have separate lectures for the women? Well, they very quickly realized that's just going to be a pain. The teacher's going to have to do twice as much work. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, this is a very Midwestern thing. There are some scholars who say, you know why Michigan ultimately goes with co-education instead of funding another school? Because we're too cheap. We don't want to fund two schools. We want to pay one tax bill and everybody goes to the same institution. Maybe there's something to that. I like to think it's more egalitarian than cheap, but I also know how politics works. The other thing that happens is those folks 4 miles down the road, after U of M starts accepting women, look at their documents and say, oh, golly gee, we can admit women too, and we probably should. So they also start to enroll women, and Eva Coriel becomes their first graduate. And she will take the same agricultural course as her brothers. It will actually take several years until you start to see domestic arts departments being built within these institutions to gear women into their own subsection of the college or of the university. And U of M will never do that. MSU does develop a women's course. That's what girls are shuttled into for decades. U of M will always accept at least some, often small numbers, but still some women to medical school, to law school, et cetera. So there we go. I tell you this story today for a few reasons. First of all, 1870 was not that long ago. We're talking 155 years ago. And it took 150 years, roughly, for those numbers to even out. When I was in college 20 years ago, women were not quite yet half of the student body or half of the graduating courses. Second thing is to keep in mind, it's tempting by American standards to say 150 years ago, golly gee, that was a long time. But there's a straight line back. And the truth is, I couldn't have gotten either of the degrees that I had we not gone through this. And prohibitions on women attending traditionally male schools existed well into and through most of the 20th century. At the old East Coast Ivies, you see sister schools that exist into the 1960s and 70s. And of course, some people prefer a women's college. Fine. But don't tell me I have to go one. Give me options. So with that, thank you very much. I hope this was worth signing up for something you didn't know anything about and had never heard of. And I hope I've convinced you that regardless of who you are, regardless of if you're male or female, regardless of if you went to a public or a private institution, I hope you feel like you can see some thread here to you today, because that's the important thing. This helped build the ecosystem that we are all still a part of. And that's important, to see ourselves as part of a broader ecosystem, not just I'm in this camp or I'm in that camp. Because at the end of the day, it took, and I know I'm saying this as a public employee in a private school, it took people on both sides. You know, the Stones always ran a private school, but they still saw the value in opening public education to women. So with that, questions? Yes, sir.
This wonderful presentation. This very last part about U of M admitting women.
Yes.
Do you have any context about how that in time compares to other state university of whichever's?
Sure. So there were a few states who got there just before us. Iowa, I think, was 1866 at their AME school. So a lot of these agriculture schools actually are agriculture and mechanical schools. So that's where we get like Texas A&M kind of thing. Basically, these are more industrial schools. They're preparing you more for hands-on things than the theoretical book stuff that U of M does. Minnesota and Wisconsin are there around the same time, late 1860s, early 1870s. The Midwest did better at this. And again, is the argument, well, because we're too cheap. I will say, because U of M was considered, because, forgive me, Mom, they were not an agricultural school because they were a little bit older and a little more well-established. They were seen as having a bigger impact than some of the ag schools because they were preparing people for professions. I will also say the next president who comes in is a man named James Angel, who very quickly decides this is a success and we need to trumpet that loudly. He will serve as president for decades. And one of his stock speaking points wherever he goes, and this man goes around the world, becomes a huge figure in American education, higher education. He will consistently say, coeducation is just fine. We have female students who are just as smart as the male students, and nobody is doing anything bad because we're putting boys and girls in the classroom together. So U of M becomes a really proud advocate for co-education, and Angel helps get other presidents and other university boards to the point of being willing to accept it because they trust him. So U of M actually is, I know I sound very down on U of M in a lot of this presentation. Because yeah, in my opinion, they did take too long to get there, but once they got there, they were fully on board and they used their weight within the academic community to push for more change. And you do see more and more change coming out of the Midwest. Yes.
My question has to do with the protection of women from being in a co-ed classroom.
Yeah.
Was sexual assault by young men so common that that was a realistic fear, or where does that come from?
It is so hard to know who to believe on these things. A lot of it was based around perception and the idea that women were inherently sexual beings. And so men could not, boys will be boys and they won't be able to behave well around them. Now, the blame is often placed on women. Woman, you're the distraction. Was there actual physical sexual assault? I have never seen that referenced in relationship to coeducation fights. I don't know how readily statistics are available for sexual violence in the 19th century. I suspect there are few statistics because most people just didn't want to talk about it overall. There was a concern, though, about distraction. There was a concern that the women were taking spots of hardworking men who can actually go get a job, and you just want to learn for the sake of learning. What's that worth? You're just going to go get married and have babies anyway. And then your brain, supposedly evaporates, I guess. Because you can only have a uterus or brain. You can't have both functioning. The other thing to keep in mind is the concern about students living in proximity. And there could have been an actual threat of sexual violence there. Most schools, at least U of M, MSU, do not have dormitories in this era. So you're boarding. And there was, in Ann Arbor, there was a big discussion about, could boarding houses accept male and female students? Would people only send their daughters if they would live in a women's only dormitory? And there were also lots of things about evening activities. Do the girls have to be home by dark? Could they belong to the societies in the evening? So it is both, I think, the age-old trope that women will lead the young boys astray. But on the other hand, was there potential danger from young boys being aggressive? I'm sure that's a danger that's always existed in the world. Yes.
My grandmother was born in 1860, went to Hull Preparatory School
Oh, good for her.
and started teaching when she was 16.
Yep.
1876. 2 years later, when she turned 18, she got married, and that was the end of the teaching career.
Yep.
Now, was that common?
Yes.
Was that
Yes.
a society? Did that That was in Holland.
That was very common. It is very, very unusual to find a school district that will hire a woman who's married. First of all, that would be considered to be extremely embarrassing to her husband. It implies that you cannot provide for her, which is what you are supposed to do. The second thing is it suggests that a woman could have separate money. Now, married women didn't have a right to their paychecks, but there was still an implication that, you know, oh, you think you need to earn money. Why? What are you trying to do on the side, if you will? You don't trust your husband. The other thing was school teachers were hired by individual school commissioners. It was very, very informal. And there were oftentimes unwritten rules or sometimes even written rules. And one of them was they did not want married women on faculty. Because the attitude is, well, you know, she'd only be here for 6 months anyway, and then she'd be pregnant and we'd have to replace her. So a lot of it comes down to this idea, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm obviously someone's child. My mother stayed home with me for 10 years. That being said, my husband and I are child-free by choice. There's a lot of this is deeply related to the cultural assumption that every woman will become a mother, and therefore her priority must be her children. She is a function of the private sphere of the family. She needs to be a wife and mother first. Anything else would come secondary, whereas a man can be a professional first and his wife will take care of the home. So yes, that was super typical. I would be shocked if you told me they continued to let her teach, honestly. Other questions or comments? Thank you. Thank you very much. Out of curiosity, did you know any of these names or any of these stories? Anybody part of the Lucinda Hinsdale Stone fan club? Yeah, okay. Did you spend time in Kalamazoo? Okay, yeah. She is, frankly, she's the one who lives to tell this tale. So she is often held up as the mother of coeducation in Michigan. And in some ways, she totally deserves that. Because yeah, she did push for years. She was part of those political fights. You know, she was the one who got Madeline to enroll and become the first female student. On the other hand, she literally lived to tell that story. The Rogers sisters didn't, which I think is why they become kind of a footnote that's only told as part of Lansing history, not as part of this bigger statewide movement. Well, thank you all again very much for coming today. I appreciate it. If you have any other questions, you can email me. And if you are looking for nice, gentle, nonpartisan, interesting history, social media content, follow us. We will not talk at all about elections, I promise.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.